Hello and welcome everyone. This is Ahmed Abdullah on behalf of OWASP White Chapter. I would like to welcome you to this workshop, and I would like to welcome our speaker, Dan. He will be taking us through an interesting journey with the API security. I just wanted to welcome you all and let you know that the event is live streamed on YouTube. I'll be sharing the YouTube link so you can get back to the session if needed at any time after we are done. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And hello, Dan.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Are we ready to go?
Yes, yes, please. It's all
Okay,
yours.
very
Thank you.
good. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to present to this community and to talk about API security. It's quite late here in San Francisco here, but really appreciate the opportunity to to present. So my name's Dan Barahona. I'm one of the founders of AppySec University. It is a site that we developed, my colleague and I, about a year and a half ago. And a little bit about AppySec University. We created the site to address a need for API security knowledge, training, awareness, education. And as you can see here on the right, we started with one course, the API pen testing course, and we've gradually grown to quite a large library of classes, and we've got many more coming. In a short 18 months, we've grown to over 70,000 students enrolled. All of our courses are free. They are free of vendor pitches or sales pitches or any kind of marketing. All our courses provide certificates and badging. And so I invite you all to come check it out. It's really been a remarkable journey and something very fulfilling to be able to be a part of this. So that's AppySec University. It's given me a chance to really learn from all of these organizations and develop some expertise around the topic. So that's what I want to talk to you today. So this conversation, this presentation is really in three sections. The first section is why are we talking about API security? Why are APIs such an attractive target for attackers? And that's what we're going to talk up front. Then in the second section, we're going to talk about real world breaches and really make this risk very real by talking about specific breaches, and we're going to connect those stories to the OWASP top 10, so that that you really have a good solid understanding of what is in the top 10 and what does it really mean in the real world. And then in the third section, we'll talk about best practices. What can you do to help keep your organization safe and secure and to keep your APIs protected from breach. Okay. Happy to take questions. I don't know, Ahmad, if we can do that in the chat, or if you can relay them. But if we have questions, happy to take them. But otherwise, I'll just dive right in. So the first thing I want to share with you is why are we talking about API security? Why is this such a hot topic? And I've got three statistics to paint a picture for you. The first is the API explosion. So 83% represents the percentage of the internet's traffic that is API based, which is really, the first time I saw that statistic, I was just stunned. And it really, points to how dominant APIs are now in how we build and develop and deploy our applications. Really an amazing technology, and it has transformed how we create integrations and share data and really run our businesses. So that's wonderful. Number one represents where Gartner believes API attacks will rank. And sadly, it's number one on the list. This is a prediction from a few years ago that unfortunately has turned out to be true. And you will see many examples here of API breaches that bear this out. And then 4% represents kind of the state of the art on API security, and specifically here, API testing for security. 96% of our testing is functionality focused. Do the APIs perform And do they deliver the functions that we're looking for? A mere 4% dedicated to, are we sure that these APIs are secure, free of vulnerabilities, and the like? And that number is way too low, and it's creating this perfect environment for breaches to happen. One of the main reasons why APIs are so appealing is just look at where they sit, right? APIs are the glue that connects our front end, right? Our web interfaces, our mobile apps. These are APIs we expose to our partners and customers, and it connects all of that to all of that back end gold, right? That data, user information, transaction engines, functionality, all of the things that we operate on the internal side can get exposed through these APIs to our customers, to our users, and also to potential attackers as well. So APIs, really sit at this focal point, and if there are any flaws in those APIs or in the backend application logic, that also can get exposed through these APIs, and we see many examples where attackers are looking for exactly those types of weaknesses, just waiting to then exploit them. The the next thing I wanted to share is if you think about, where we have spent a lot of our security effort, it's often right at that front end, right? The web app, the mobile app. That's where we authenticate users. That's where we filter data to make sure people only see what they should see. It's where we share certain buttons of functionality, but not enable others. It's really, where we enforce a lot of security controls. But what attackers are doing is simply going right around all that security, and they're targeting the APIs that live right behind it, that the front end relies on. And what they're finding with these APIs often are APIs that are over permissioned. They have access to too much information, access to functionality that we don't want to expose on our UIs, and can even expose logic flaws that might exist in the backend application logic. So for this reason as well, APIs make a really nice target, right? They're far less secure in many cases than what we see on our front ends and in the UIs. And you'll see this in some of the examples that I'll share. The other reason is if you think about the classic cyber attack, this is also known as the kill chain. It's really quite a complex process, right? Starts with recon and then infiltration and weaponization and lateral movement and so forth. It's complex, it's sophisticated, and takes a lot of time, right? A lot of capability, a lot of skills. If you compare that to an API attack, this is really what it looks like. These attackers are looking around at your APIs. They're trying different things, looking for a vulnerability. And once they've found one, they can pretty much go straight to breach, right? And we've seen this many times over, and I'll show you examples of this, but it's a much simpler process for the attacker than kind of the classic cyber attack. And I'll mention that the API risks have come under the attention of regulators and agencies and government organizations. Here are just a handful. I won't go through all of them. Privacy initiatives are very relevant to APIs. If you think about all that potentially sensitive information, user information that APIs can touch, that makes APIs very relevant from a privacy perspective, right? But the one I really want to mention here is PCI, payment card industry. So they issued a new standard. It's called DSS 4.0, the data security standard. It's the first update to this standard in almost 5-6 years. And unlike 3.0, where there was no mention of APIs, they're very, very prominent in the 4.0 standard. And if you are a payment processor or take credit card transactions or anything like that, then you're subject to these PCI requirements. And this DSS 4.0 is the deadline is March 31, so barely a month from now. That becomes law of the land. And it has a lot to say about APIs, things like abuse of business logic, manipulation of APIs, shifting left testing of APIs, detection of vulnerabilities. We have a whole course dedicated to exactly this, the API security for PCI compliance on AppySec University. If you'd like to learn more, I definitely recommend you check out that course. We have other, worksheets and the like that can help you as well. But the main point here is simply that um, API risks have certainly gotten the attention of the regulatory environment, the regulatory bodies, and they're looking at organizations to take API security seriously. So, so that kind of wraps up the like, why are we talking about API security? Why are attackers targeting APIs? And so let's talk about breaches, right? And I won't go through all of these, but this is a sampling of kind of the, highly publicized API breaches that have taken place over the last few years. And the main thing I want you to take away from this slide is just the sheer volume of it. The quantity of breaches that have taken place, the volume of records that have gotten exposed as a result of those breaches, and that, these are highly reputable companies, right, that have strong security teams with great technologies in place. And somehow still those APIs manage to get exploited, right? And that's what I want to examine here in the coming slides. Like, how exactly is this happening? And is there anything we can learn from these that will help us keep our own APIs more secure? So what I want to do is share some stories of probably maybe 4 or 5 specific examples and connect those examples to the OWASP top 10. So you're obviously very familiar with the OWASP Web Top 10. It's really been the industry standard for many, many years. And as you may know, the OWASP community created an API-specific top 10 back in 2019 and kind of refreshed that top 10 in 2023, which is what you're seeing here below. So rather than go line by line through the top 10, I'd rather give you some examples and then connect those to the relevant OWASP category. So the first example I want to share with you is Coinbase. And this is a really great example of an abuse of an application logic flaw. Now, in this case, there was a researcher who wanted to examine the Coinbase platform and see if they could find any vulnerabilities or flaws or anything like this. And in very hacker fashion, the first thing they did was create an account on Coinbase, utilize the application and the front end, and trade crypto, look up pricing, do all kinds of different activities on the platform. And while doing that, watching the traffic that was taking place between the front end and the back end and identifying those API calls that were happening. And what you're seeing here is the specific API call for what happens when you do a sell order on a particular asset that you own. So what this person did after discovering the APIs was to begin trading directly on the API, right? So not going through the UI itself, but utilizing the API directly. And this is one of the reasons why attackers go around the UI is when they can target the API directly, you have no longer any of those controls or restrictions that the front end might impose. So the next thing they wanted to do was to deliver some intentionally erroneous requests through this API to the back end with the goal of retrieving some sort of error messaging back. And many times we deliver valuable information or insights in these error messages. And so that's a pretty good hacker technique, right? Send some incorrect requests and see what kind of useful information you might get back. Now, what happened here in this case is you might see at the very bottom this 0.0243. So this researcher owned 0.0243 units of Ethereum, right? And what they wanted to do was to do a sell order, but they wanted it to be an incorrect one. So they backspaced over the Ethereum and they wrote Bitcoin instead, right? They owned no Bitcoin whatsoever, right? So there's no way this transaction should have processed. So they went ahead, sent an order to sell Bitcoin that they didn't own, and waited for the error message to come back. And what came back was not an error message, but instead $43,000 deposited into their account. It actually traded his Ethereum as Bitcoin. And he made this, tremendous windfall, selling an asset he didn't even own. I think he must have been totally shocked. And at that point, went onto Twitter, trying to find the email of the CEO to let them know he'd found a market nuking vulnerability. And I don't think he was exaggerating when he said that. Now, Coinbase gets a tremendous amount of credit in my opinion. They immediately responded. They validated the issue. They shut down the market for a day, and then fixed it, right? And actually, I bet the fix wasn't even all that complicated. And then they kindly blogged about what exactly happened, and this is straight from their website. The root cause of the bug was a missing logic validation check. And this is something we see quite a lot with API. So what was happening on the back end was the engine was checking if he owned enough quantity of the asset, 0.0243 units, but it wasn't checking which asset, right? So he could have put whatever type of asset he wanted, and it would have sold it as that, right? And so what they needed to do was simply to add another line of code to make sure that this user was selling something that they actually owned, and that would have avoided this whole vulnerability altogether. Coinbase rewarded this researcher with $250,000 bug bounty, the highest they've ever paid. And it really goes to show like how a simple flaw in an API or in an application logic can get exposed through the API and exploited in this way. So that's Coinbase, right? The next example, and I'm going to share some pro tips here or best practices. And the one here is simply that your UI is not part of your security. It certainly may feel like it. It's where a lot of times we bolt on or add some security controls. It's where we filter data or things like that. But if you think about this attack, it couldn't have happened in the UI, right? There's no way to change your asset class from one object to another. It could only have been done at the API. And so it just goes to show that relying on the UI to enforce those controls is a dangerous approach, because clearly that all those controls can get bypassed when they target the API directly. So that's Coinbase. The next example is Peloton. This is the exercise equipment manufacturer, and an attacker discovered an API that was communicating between the application and the back end. This was a wide open API, so no security, no password required, and it had access to all 4 million users' data on the platform, even President Joe Biden's records accessible through this API. Now, after some public disclosure of this finding, Peloton went and they fixed the issue. And what they did was they added security credentials, password credentials to that API endpoint, and they thought they were done. Right now, this was no longer an open API. You had to have valid username and password in order to access it. But the problem was, it was pretty easy to create an account. You could just set one up for free on their website. You could use those credentials. You can access the endpoint, and you still had access to all 4 million users. And this is an example of authorization, right? And the pro tip here is don't confuse authentication with authorization. They solved authentication. They added credentials. They made sure users had to have valid passwords to access the API, but they didn't address authorization, right? I should only be able to see my records through this API, but instead I could see everybody's records, and that was the flaw here. And both of these examples are good examples of OWASP API number 1, broken object level authorization, which is also known as BOLA. Oh, let me go back. And the most common example here is, can user A access user B's records, right? If that's the case, and it's not by design, then you've got an authorization flaw, right? And we see many examples of this. You'll see more in the coming examples. So the next one is Duolingo. This is the language learning application. It's very, very popular. They had 2.5 million records harvested through a vulnerability in one of their APIs. And what happened was, again, an attacker found an open API that was not protected, right? No credentials, no passwords. And if you supplied an email address to this endpoint, it would respond A, if they were a valid user in the Duolingo platform, and B, it would share all of their details, right? And so what they did was they exploited this endpoint and found 2.5 million valid accounts and harvested all of the information from it. So I went ahead, I'm a Duolingo user myself, and I went ahead and hacked myself. And this is what it looked like. This is straight, like, completely real data from my own breach. So that's my email address at the top. And all you had to do was simply go to this API endpoint, provide any email address, and it would respond whether that's a valid user, and then all of this information. You can see I've got a 600-day streak. I'm learning Italian, all of these things. And remarkably, Duolingo's response to this was, there's no problem here, right? There's nothing sensitive in this data and so forth, which I significantly disagree with. There's lots of useful information, but most importantly, by using this API, they were taking my public information, if you want to call it that, and connecting it to my private information, my email address, and other things like that. And that is super valuable to a phishing scammer and so forth. So the pro tip here is your hidden APIs will get discovered, right? I can only imagine that the developers of this application never expected that this API would get discovered or utilized or exploited in any way. And in fact, it's quite easy to discover these things with some pretty basic knowledge. And attackers are looking for ways to exploit these kinds of things. So this is a good example of OWASP API number 2, which is broken authentication. It's defined as weak or poor authentication. Authentication that might be vulnerable to brute force attacks or weak password requirements or that sort of thing. But to be honest with you, what we see most of the time is not that. What we see is total absence of authentication. That's what we saw here at Peloton, at Duolingo. APIs that get left wide open for no good reason, all right, and should be behind some sort of security, password controls, something like that. And that's what we see more often with OWASP API number 2. Okay, next example for API number 3 is Venmo. So this is the payment platform, and they had a feature on the homepage that would show you like the most recent 10, 20 transactions, and it would filter out all the sensitive information, right? So last names or account details or whatever it might be. And again, an attacker found this API. It was again left open without any credentials. And what was amazing was when they called the API directly, it didn't return anonymized data. It returned the entire original record, first names and last names, and everything else related to those transactions. And so they wrote a script, and they, over time, harvested over 200 million transactions from Venmo in full detail, right? So the pro tip here is don't filter data in the UI, right? The API shouldn't return more data than is necessary and then rely on the UI to extract only the information that should be presented. We know that attackers are going to look for those APIs. If they return all the data, then now that data is exposed. And that's exactly what happened here at Venmo. So if you need filtered data, create an API that only returns filtered data and then, publish that. Not to mention, they probably should have put some security or some sort of, password requirements on top of this API endpoint. So this is a good example of OWASP API number 3. It's got kind of a complicated name, broken object property level authorization. They used to call it excessive data exposure, which I think is quite intuitive, right? And what we're seeing here is basically an API endpoint that was returning too much detail, too much information, far beyond what was necessary for the application to do what it needed to do. And that's what was happening here, and that's what resulted in this breach at Venmo. Okay, for number 4, this one is quite fresh. This is only about a month ago at Trello. And what you're seeing here is the dark web posting of 15 million records up for sale that were harvested through through an API. And what happened here, it's kind of like what happened to Duolingo. There's a feature on Trello where you can invite someone to your project using their email address. And so this API endpoint accepts a user email, and if it matches, right, it's a valid user on Trello, it will then reply and return their public Trello profile information. The thing about that is in Trello, that public information is not associated with your email address, right? So it's just a public profile of, an anonymous person. But by connecting that information to the email address, it's no longer anonymous, right? And it becomes very valuable, as we've seen. So what this attacker did was they went on the dark web and they harvested 500 million previously exposed email addresses. And they took all 500 million and sent it at this API endpoint. And they found 15 million matches, and that's what they put up for sale here on the dark web. So the pro tip here is, first of all, how can 500 million requests not go detected and blocked? Well, it just goes to show that attackers are very clever about evading detection, right? Even at the scale of 500 million attempts. They use multiple IP addresses and proxies and all of these kinds of things to defeat their rate limiting detections and protections that existed at Trello, right? So those rate limits are kind of your last resort. And so this is an example of OWASP number 4, unrestricted resource consumption, or what we used to be called lack of resources and rate limiting. So wherever we see examples of millions of records being harvested, that's an example of OWASP number 4. Now, interestingly, the fix here wasn't to improve the rate limiting, because we saw that these attackers are pretty clever about evading. What the fix was to not leave that API open without any security, without any password controls. So what they did was they enforced password controls on that endpoint. So no longer could I hit that API anonymously, right? I have to have a valid account. And now if I want to send 500 million requests, even if I spread that across 1,000 fake accounts, it's still going to be a huge amount of traffic, and it's going to be very easy to detect now, right? Because it's now associated with a given user. So that's OWASP API number 4. For number 5, this is an application called Bumble, which is a dating application. They got a lot of things. They had a lot of issues with their APIs, but the reason why this is an OWASP API number 5 issue, which is broken function level authorization, is they not only exposed data that belonged to other users, but they also exposed functionality in their application that shouldn't be exposed to end users. Namely, there's an endpoint that allows you to not only check what category of user someone is. Are they a free user, a paid user, or something like that? But you could even modify those records. You could modify an account type. So if I was a free user and I wanted to have the benefits of a paid account, I could use this endpoint to elevate my privilege to a paid user. And that is an example of a function authorization flaw, right? That's a function that shouldn't be exposed to me. I shouldn't be able to, on my own, change my account type from free to paid. I should only be able to do that by submitting proper payment and filling out the right forms, and some backend process can do that, can make that change. But in this case, that function was left exposed. The user was able to access it, and they could make all kinds of changes to that endpoint. There are all kinds of other, examples of this. You wouldn't want users to be able to change their balance due from $100 down to 0, or even worse, to a negative number, right? So these are all examples of function level abuses that can happen with APIs. And then I think the last example I want to share with you before I get through the rest of the OWASP top 10 is Instagram. So this was an API flaw that allowed an attacker to take over any Instagram user's account if they wanted to. So let's say you wanted to take over Taylor Swift's account. This is what you could do. Doesn't work anymore, but there was a time when this would have worked. So you would pretend to be Taylor Swift. You'd say you forgot your password, and it would send a 6-digit code to the owner. That's a million combinations, right? And it turns out that you could supply your code guess, if you will, through an API endpoint, which is really convenient for automation and scripting, right? And so this attacker, or in this case, I think it was a researcher, did was they simply utilized this endpoint to guess all the possible combinations from 1 through a million, starting at 1 and making their way through until they got to the correct reset code. Now, what happened was after 200 guesses, it stopped working. They couldn't send any more guesses, right? And there was a 10-minute timeout on the code and so forth. But what they did then was they changed their IP address and they got another 200 guesses. And they changed their IP address again, 200 more guesses, and so on and so forth. And very easily within the 10-minute timeout could get through all 1 million combinations. And that's how they could have taken over literally anybody's Instagram account. And this is a good example of OWASP number 6, which is a new one in 2023, which is unrestricted access to sensitive business flows, right? In this case, the sensitive business flow was the password reset function. It could be other things like, let's say Taylor Swift had a new concert for sale at 10 a.m., utilizing an API to purchase all the inventory of tickets in a matter of seconds so that you can resell them at a huge profit. That's another abuse of a business flow. And so the main point here is organizations need to think about their business, their operations, and how that business flow, those application logic can be exploited in ways that maybe are unintended, right? That weren't designed, and to build in protections to make sure that those exploits can't actually be carried out. So that's number 6. I'll just go through the rest of them real quick. Number 7 is a new one, server-side request forgery. What we're talking about here is inputs to your API that are malicious, right? So the fix here, or the best practice, is to always do input validation to ensure that the APIs, that the inputs that are coming to your APIs are checked to make sure they're valid. And if they don't match what you're looking for, you throw it away. So imagine, for example, you have a function on your application where a user can create a profile with their name, email, address, their LinkedIn URL, Twitter handle, whatever it might be. Now imagine in that LinkedIn URL, instead of it looking like www.linkedin.com/whatever, they instead put localhost API user data or Etsy password or an injection or a link to a malicious malware site or something like that. Your API should check to make sure whatever shows up in that input looks like a LinkedIn URL. And if it doesn't, you throw it away, right? That's what input validation is. And it's really all about zero trust, if you want to call it that. But make sure you're checking what comes into your API before you do any processing with it. So that's number 7. Number 8 is carryover. It's called security misconfiguration. This is kind of like good housekeeping or blocking and tackling, whatever you want to call it. But basically, make sure that the servers that are running your APIs, that all the configs and any kind of adjustments that you can make on those systems are set properly, right? So having proper hardening, doing the right patching, turning off services that don't need to be running, enabling encryption, setting CORS policies, all that kind of stuff should be properly configured. And we've actually got a course on AppySec University called Securing API Servers. It's a really great course that goes through a lot of these topics. So if you want to learn more, I definitely recommend that course. Number 9 is also a new one. It's called improper inventory management. And this really has to do with, do you have versions of your APIs or APIs at all that are that you don't know about or can be accessed by individuals that you don't want accessing it? The most common example of improper inventory management is version control, right? So If you upgrade your API from version 2 to version 3, typically that looks like a URL path that looks like slash API slash v3 and then the rest of the API. When attackers see that, when they see that v3, you know they're going to try v2, they're going to try v1 and see if they're still available, right? And oftentimes they are. And oftentimes those older versions of APIs have lower levels of security. There are endpoints that shouldn't be out there any longer. May have vulnerabilities that they're unaware of. Have lower levels of testing and validation. So for number 9, you definitely want to make sure you know what APIs you have, what's out there, who has access to it, and it's only those APIs that you are confident publishing and making available. Okay, so that's number 9. For 10, this is a new one, unsafe consumption of APIs. This really reflects the risk of third-party APIs, right? So if you utilize APIs from Salesforce.com or DocuSign or wherever they come from, you want to do a lot of the same security best practices. You want to do input validation, right? Don't trust what's coming back from those APIs. You know, do the testing that you need to do to make sure those APIs are secure, that there isn't any exposures or vulnerabilities that can come from utilizing those third parties. Okay, so that wraps up our discussion of real-world breaches and connecting them to the OWASP top 10. We definitely saw certain patterns in the vulnerabilities, and that's what we want to talk about here next with regard to what can you do to keep your APIs secure. So having been in this market for a number of years, we developed this concept of this framework, if you want to call it that, of the 3 pillars of API security. And those pillars are governance, testing, and monitoring. And we'll talk a little bit about each one, but governance really is about how do you, in your organization, define, develop, and deploy APIs, right? How do you ensure that's done properly with security and that you have confidence that your APIs are not vulnerable? Testing is, of course, how do we validate? How do we identify vulnerabilities? How do we fix any issues that might have entered into those APIs? And then monitoring is, how do we detect threats as they are happening? How do we block those malicious activities as they happen, and so forth? So let's just provide a little bit of detail on each one of these. We have whole courses and webinars dedicated to each one of these, so we can't, in this amount of time, go deep. But for governance, as I mentioned, this is how you set your standards in your organization for developing and deploying APIs. It starts with awareness, right? Do you have visibility into all of your APIs? Do you know what data they're touching? Do you know what sort of controls are in place? Who created the API? Where is it running? All of that kind of information. Do you have the documentation and so forth? That's what awareness is all about, right? You need to have that visibility if you're going to secure these APIs. Then on the other side, you've got policy and process, right? Do you have a well-defined, well-thought-out process for how APIs get created, developed, tested, deployed, monitored, and even retired in your organization? Have you set style guide standards so that all APIs look and feel similar? Have you got documentation requirements? Are you managing everything in a common gateway and so forth? Those are all topics that you need to think about when you're defining your governance policies for APIs, right? And we really believe this should be something that's carefully thought through. You bring all the teams together and you document and publish those standards across the organization. So that's governance. Let's talk about testing. I mentioned this up front, right? A lot of the testing that we do is focused on, does the application do what it's supposed to do, right? We would never push any product into production without doing that kind of functionality testing. It needs to perform in order to go live. Unfortunately, way down at 4% is security testing, right? And that's where we're looking for flaws, vulnerabilities, other types of issues that can be exploited by an attacker. And so one of the best things we can do to improve security of our APIs is to make sure that the people creating them understand how attackers are targeting APIs, what techniques they're using to exploit those APIs, and what kinds of things can developers integrate into their code to prevent those types of vulnerabilities. So the pro tip here is to provide this kind of training to your developers, to the people that are creating these APIs. I do workshops like this all of the time for organizations to help them achieve exactly that, right? To bring more awareness and visibility into API risks for the people that are actually creating those APIs. So some of the things that you should be thinking about in terms of testing, there's security-oriented topics. So do you have unsecured endpoints? Are we utilizing incremental IDs that make it easy for attackers to harvest information? Have you run injections and fuzzing attacks and the like to see if there are any of those types of vulnerabilities? Then we've got data-oriented testing, right? So what kind of data is this API touching? What kind of data is coming back? Is it sensitive? Is there private information? Is there healthcare? Are there banking records or any of this type of sensitive data in the information that this API is returning? And is that appropriate for the use case that this API is responsible for? And then we have logic tests, right? So can I manipulate object IDs, user IDs, other types of things to gain access to information or to execute transactions that are fraudulent or improper? Can I abuse access controls? Are there role-based permissioning issues? Have permissions changed in ways that I don't know about? All kinds of tests that you should be thinking about how you can automate and run against your APIs. And then lastly, on the monitoring side, here really we're talking about two main things, right? There's runtime protection, which is typically done by a gateway, right? The gateway can do the function of authenticating users, giving them access to specific endpoints and so forth. The gateway can do traffic filtering, input validation, make sure that, if we're expecting an 8-digit integer, that, a SQL injection doesn't get submitted instead. We actually have a whole course dedicated to API gateway security that you can find on our website. And then you've got threat detection, right? This is typically done by a WAF. You might use a SIM or other types of tools, typically used for rate limiting and volumetric attacks to the extent that you can prevent those. Looking for fraudulent traffic or trying to identify APIs that you might not know about. Many WAFs now have functionality like that, can actually discover APIs for you. The pro tip here is simply to recognize this is your kind of last line of defense, right? And so the best practice here is to make sure your APIs are as secure as possible before they ever go live, and to understand that you can't rely on these runtime defenses to protect you against everything. Because clearly, if you look at all those breaches, most of those organizations, if not all of them, were employing a lot of these technologies, gateways, WAFs, SIMs, and so forth. And still those attacks managed to get through. So we need to think about how can we have more security in depth with our APIs. So that brings us to kind of the last topic I want to talk about, which is what is causing these API breaches to be so successful? And is there anything we can learn from them to help us better protect ourselves and our own APIs? So we looked at that list of all those API breaches and analyzed what was really happening there. What were the core issues involved? And this is what we found. You can see here that, a handful of issues, right, of OWASP categories really account for the majority of the breaches. Now, you might conclude that the number one issue to fix is rate limiting, right? Because we saw so many examples of millions of records being harvested through these APIs. But I actually think that's not necessarily the correct conclusion to reach. the the fact that the rate limiting didn't prevent those breaches is really testament to how difficult it is to block a determined attacker, right? They can hide their activity, they can use multiple IPs and different identities to execute their attacks, and it's very, very difficult to prevent all of those from happening. And really, at the core issue wasn't that there was inadequate rate limiting. The core issue was there are APIs revealing valuable data, and they were able to exfiltrate that data in mass volumes, right? So if you look at what the next sort of contributors to these vulnerabilities or these breaches was, it's these three things: OWASP number one, number two, and number three. This combination, one or more of these, was responsible for 90% of the breaches that took place on that list that I showed you. And what were we talking about? Broken authorization. Can user A see user B's data? That's the authorization flaw. Broken authentication, not like brute forcing passwords, but literally the absence of authentication in all of those examples that I showed you. And number three, APIs that are revealing excessive amounts of data, excessive details, information that wasn't necessary to reveal in that API call. And it turns out these three things contributed to 90% of those breaches, right? So if you can address those three elements and find any flaws that you might have before they go live, you've just made yourself vastly more secure than most organizations. So the next question is, how do you go about doing that? So we kind of mapped out here the API lifecycle, everything from when an API is first considered and identified, all the way through retirement when we no longer need that API or we version it out. And if you look at what kinds of capabilities exist throughout this lifecycle, right, it starts with governance, right? So if you're thinking about a new API, let's talk about it. Let's identify what it's doing, what kind of data, what's doing a risk assessment, and understand how do we make sure we design this API with security in mind, all right? That's driven by governance. So then you go into development, right? And so you're going to write your code, you're going to do your code reviews, you're going to use static analysis and, look for vulnerable libraries and all that kind of stuff, which is important. You should do that. But not one of those breaches was a result of a vulnerable library or anything like that, right? That's not what's leading to API breaches. So then you get into testing, right? And here's where I think we have the biggest gap, right? Our legacy dynamic application testing tools are weak on APIs, right? They're great for looking for injection vulnerabilities and cross-site scripting and these sort of common vulnerabilities, but APIs get breached with not common vulnerabilities, like your unique application logic. And so you're left with manual pen testing, red teams, and the like, which can be effective, but you can't scale that, right? If you've got 100, 1,000 APIs, you can't run that kind of volume of pen tests. And running a pen test once or twice a year when you are releasing code 52 times a year means a lot of code's going untested, right? So this is why we think there's a significant security gap between development and deployment, right? And then once you get into production, you've got your gateway and your WAF and your SIEM. And as we've talked about, those are kind of like last line of defense, right? They are only effective to a certain level of preventing and blocking certain types of threats. But as we saw, right, many attacks make their way through. So the next dimension that we wanted to look at is where can we ideally find those vulnerabilities and remediate them that we talked about before, right? The OWASP 1, 2, and 3, right? And it's not to say 4, 5, 6 through 10 are not important. They're very important, right? And they probably also can be detected here in a similar way. But just focusing on that 90%, like how do we get the 90% better coverage? Well, it turns out if you want to find authorization flaws, the best way to do that is with testing, right? Literally like log in as user A and try to access user B's records, and you can find authorization flaws, right? Broken authentication, same sort of thing. Excess data exposure, run commands on every API and look at the data that's coming out. Is it suitable for the application? Is it excessive, right? Now, some of this you can find in runtime, but all things equal, we believe you should find vulnerabilities before they ever go live, right? Before they ever get into production, right? The whole notion of shift left and DevSecOps and so forth. Which leads to the final question here, which is, okay, how do we go about filling the security gap of weak testing, right? And so here are the goals of what a testing program should achieve, right? It should be automated, right? You can't rely on manual testing. It won't scale. You can't run a test every night or every week whenever you do a new release, right? So we've got to incorporate automation. It needs to be comprehensive, right? And what does that mean? Every API endpoint getting tested across authorization, authentication, data exposure, fuzzing, cross-site scripting, you name it. That means creating potentially thousands of different attack scenarios for your APIs, right? And you're not going to be able to achieve that manually either, right? You're going to need to incorporate some intelligence in how you generate these tests. And then lastly, it needs to be continuous, right? It can't be once or twice a year. It should be part of your release cycle, part of the CI/CD pipeline. So every release gets tested automatically without anyone having to be involved manually. And people have asked me for some tips or some, technologies out there that they might look into. So here you go. All of these are freely available technologies. Some have paid versions as well. If you want to learn more about testing, I would just recommend that you follow up with me. Excuse me. This is a topic that I know very, very, very well, and we can help you identify good strategies for your organization to improve the testing. Okay, so this is my last slide of content here before we wrap up. And people often like to get sort of like a top 10 list of best practices or do's and don'ts, if you will. So here's my list, having been in this market for a while, some of the common things that we see. So I highly recommend you start with governance, as we've talked about, like really, define the processes and your standards and your requirements in your organization and enforce that across the team, right? So every API gets developed with the same level of security as all the others. Know your APIs, right? So you got to know what APIs you have, what are they doing, what data do they access, where are they running, who created it, all of that kind of information. And one of the best ways to learn about APIs is to drive collaboration between the security team and the development organization, right? Many security teams that I talk to, they say, we don't know what APIs we've got. We need to go buy some tools to go find them and discover them. Whenever I talk to an engineering leader, that's not what they say, right? They would never say, we don't know what we've got. They've got a pretty good idea, right? And so this collaboration is really critical. And we know that development needs to be involved in the creation of more secure APIs. So let's create that culture of collaboration there. Let's get these teams communicating in more significant ways than we have had so far. API documentation is non-negotiable, right? We need all APIs to be well documented with API specifications. That's really critical for usability, but it's also really critical for security as well. Let's train our developers to be knowledgeable and savvy to API risks so they can create more secure APIs in the first place. Let's centralize APIs in a common management platform. So, let's avoid any possibility of shadow and rogue or unknown APIs. That shouldn't be possible. Right. Engineers shouldn't be able to create and stand up their own API with nobody knowing about it. All right. It should all be centralized in a common management layer. Don't trust any inputs to your API. So this is the input validation message that we talked about earlier. Definitely do not rely on the UI as part of security. All right. Don't filter data in the UI. Don't, restrict access in the UI and then leave it wide open at the API layer. Remember that authentication is not the same as authorization. Authentication is pretty easy to solve. You can do that in in the gateway. Authorization probably needs to be back in the logic layer of the application itself, right? Another reason why we want developers to be aware of these API risks. And last, of course, is let's bridge that security gap in testing, right? Let's take that 4% and make it 40%, right? That would be a huge increase, and you will find significant improvements in your API security. So that's my last slide. I really appreciate it. I did want to give you one more invitation, and that is to AppySecCon. We just announced this yesterday, so we're extremely excited about this. This is a live virtual event. So you can join this event from anywhere in the world. It's totally free. No vendors, no expos, no sales pitches. It's just really brilliant speakers, the really leading authorities on API security coming together to talk about this really important topic. So I invite you to come enroll and register for this event on May 22nd. We know time zones are tricky. So, join while you can, but all of the sessions will get recorded. And if you register, you'll get access to all of those as well. So please take a look at this URL, conf.appysecuniversity.com, if you'd like to attend and register. We'd love to have you. And with that, I think that's my last slide. Just want to say thank you again. I really appreciate you all giving me this opportunity to speak to you. There's my email address. I'm very accessible. Love to hear from you. If you want to learn more, ask questions, talk about testing or anything else, please be in touch. Come check out our courses on AppySec University. They're really fantastic. Ahmad can probably tell you about it. He's taken a bunch of them. And with that, I guess I'll just leave it here on this slide in case you need that URL. Ahmad, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you. It was a nice session and full of very interesting and very useful insights. Yeah, and definitely, yeah, I'm one of the people who's going to AppySec definitely on regular basis and checking the new content. And I'm always getting excited about the new updates. I'm getting excited about the AppySecCon. I think it has been just announced recently, right?
Just yesterday we announced, and we've already
Just
got.
yesterday. Okay. So we are from the lucky few that we hear you talk about it at the first time. So
Yeah,
yeah, thank you.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I appreciate it. No, definitely very, very excited. It's really an honor to be able to host such a thing. So definitely please sign up if you're interested.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for your time and thanks for joining. Thank you so much, Dan. I know that has been a long day for you, but thank you so much for taking the chance and just giving us this very useful session. It was a pleasure. Thank you all. And I would like just to remind you that the session was streamed and I'll be sharing the YouTube streaming link in case if you would like to share it with someone, in case if you would like to get back to the session anytime soon. It will be there on the YouTube. Thank you so much, all. Thank you so much, Dan. Have
Take
a
care,
great
everybody.
night, and thank you so much, everyone, and see you in the upcoming one. Thank you. Take care.